You think you've seen powerful debates before? Wait until you hear how Jasmine Crockett turned a moral attack into a masterclass in grace and truth in less than a minute. The hearing room in Washington was unusually quiet that morning. Not the regular kind of quiet that comes with paperwork and coffee cups, but the kind that hums with tension. The kind that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Thick curtains filtered the sunlight, leaving streaks of gold across rows of polished tables. Microphones stood like sentinels, waiting for the first voice to break the silence. Every seat was taken. Lawmakers, aides, journalists, all gathered to witness what many whispered could be the most uncomfortable session of the month. At the head of the room sat Justice Clarence Thomas. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. His presence alone filled the air. His reputation preceded him. Decades on the Supreme Court, countless rulings that shaped the nation, and a voice that carried the weight of conviction. To some, he was a symbol of strength and principle. To others, a wall that refused to move with the times. Thomas's expression was unreadable, carved from patience and pride. His hands were folded neatly before him, his chin lifted just slightly, as though he was already preparing for battle before the first question had even been asked. Across the room sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Younger, energetic, sharp, she didn't have his years of power, but she had something else: clarity. The kind that cuts through confusion and forces people to listen. Her presence didn't fill the room the way Thomas's did, but it shifted it. Wherever she was, attention followed. She glanced once at her notes. Short bullet points, nothing fancy, then set her pen down. She didn't need a script. She never did. Crockett was known for speaking from the center of her truth, and that made her dangerous in rooms like this. The two of them couldn't have been more different. He represented the old guard, a believer in tradition, restraint, and moral authority. She represented a new era, bold, transparent, unwilling to let hierarchy decide who gets to speak. Between them was not just a table. It was a line between generations, between power and principle. As the clock struck 9, the chairperson called the room to order. The shuffle of papers and coughs echoed once, then faded. Thomas adjusted his glasses, still silent. Crockett folded her hands, her face calm but alert. Everyone knew this session was meant to discuss judicial ethics. But beneath that label there was more. Something personal, something brewing. It wasn't just about laws. It was about what defines moral leadership. And if you looked close enough, you could see it in the eyes of the people watching. They knew this wasn't going to be routine. Thomas finally looked up. His eyes swept the room, then landed briefly on Jasmine Crockett. There was no hostility in that look, only the quiet certainty of a man who believed he had the moral high ground. He'd done this for decades. He'd spoken in rooms that challenged him, rooms that praised him, rooms that questioned his every decision. But this felt different. And for Crockett, sitting across from him, it wasn't intimidation she felt. It was curiosity. The kind that comes from facing someone you respect even if you don't agree with them. She had studied his words, his rulings, his speeches. She knew what he stood for, and she also knew where his arguments cracked under light. The audience could feel it too, that strange electricity when two forces prepare to meet. Calm on the outside, collision on the inside. Reporters adjusted their recorders. Aides leaned closer to their bosses. Every small sound felt loud, a pen tapping, a whisper, the ticking clock. Thomas leaned slightly forward. A small movement, but it made people sit straighter. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping once before he stilled them. Crockett's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered with something: readiness. And that's when the chairperson's voice broke the tension. "Justice Thomas, you have the floor." Those words were the signal. The match had been lit. Thomas adjusted his microphone, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a slow roll of thunder. "Thank you," he said calmly. Then a pause, long enough for everyone to look up, long enough to build expectation. "I've been asked to speak on the matter of morals in public service," he began, "and I intend to do just that." His tone was smooth but heavy with intention. He wasn't here to share. He was here to remind. To draw a line between what he believed was right and what he believed others had forgotten. Crockett didn't move. She listened carefully, pen still untouched, her attention locked on him. The way Thomas spoke was deliberate, each word chosen, each pause measured. He spoke of integrity, of honor, of the responsibility that comes with power. But underneath those words, something sharper lurked, an unspoken criticism. Somewhere between the rhythm of his sentences, the message became clear. He wasn't talking about morals in general. He was talking about her. That realization didn't make her flinch. If anything, it made her lean in just slightly, her focus narrowing, her expression unreadable. The hearing room was now more than a stage. It was a battlefield of ideas. And while Thomas carried the armor of experience, Crockett carried the weapon of truth. What no one knew, not yet, was that before the hour ended, the quietest person in the room would deliver the line that silenced even the mighty. And when it came, it would only take 41 seconds. The moment Clarence Thomas began to speak, the air shifted. His voice was deep, calm, and heavy with certainty. It was the kind of tone that didn't need volume to demand attention. Every word landed with weight. He wasn't rushing. He spoke like a man who knew he owned the room. He started slowly, as if setting the stage for a sermon. When I was growing up, he said, morality meant something. It was not a matter of opinion. It was a way of life. His words rolled steady and smooth, but there was sharpness hiding inside them. He spoke of lost values, of leaders who forgot what true integrity looked like, of people who wore ethics like decoration instead of duty. Eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Everyone knew this speech wasn't random. Thomas wasn't speaking to the air, he was aiming. His tone never named her, but the meaning was clear. Each phrase felt like a challenge wrapped in wisdom. He continued, I watch this new generation talk about justice and equality. But justice without discipline is chaos. Equality without responsibility is confusion. Morality is not about convenience. It is about courage. The words carried the rhythm of authority. Some nodded impressed. Others shifted uncomfortably, feeling the tension rise. Thomas's expression never changed. His voice stayed steady. But the undercurrent in the room grew louder, invisible but strong, a tide of anticipation building toward something inevitable. Crockett listened without interrupting. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her pen still beside her notes. She blinked slowly, unbothered. To anyone watching closely, it looked like she was letting him finish. But to those who knew her, she was waiting. Thomas leaned forward slightly. We cannot rebuild a strong nation on the shaky ground of moral confusion, he said. And we cannot preach about integrity while practicing inconsistency. That last line hung in the air. It wasn't just a statement, it was a strike. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Crockett's eyes lifted toward him, calm and steady. Around her, the quiet deepened. The energy of the room was a living thing now, tightening with every second that passed. Thomas went on, his voice now firmer. I've seen far too many who claim to serve justice yet fail to serve truth. They speak with passion, but passion without principles is empty. He paused, just long enough to let that land. Then softly but clearly he added, if we have lost our sense of moral clarity, then maybe it's because too many people think conviction is something you can fake. A quiet gasp broke out somewhere in the back row. Even those who admired Thomas exchanged glances. It was clear now this was no lecture about ethics in general. It was personal. His words weren't aimed at an idea. They were aimed at a person sitting right across from him. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless. Her expression didn't give away a single thought, but the room could feel something brewing behind her stillness, not anger. Not fear, but something sharper. Thomas finished his point with finality, his last line striking like a gavel. That, he said, is what separates talk from truth. He leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights. His face was calm, almost satisfied. He believed he had said what needed to be said. Around the room, people shifted, half expecting Crockett to stay quiet, to let it pass. After all, Clarence Thomas was not a man easily confronted. His authority was legendary, his words carved from decades of certainty. But then, Jasmine Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her pen, not to write, but to set it neatly aside. It was a small gesture, but somehow it made every heartbeat in the room feel louder. Thomas's eyes flicked toward her, curious. Crockett met his gaze. The silence stretched, thick and electric. Then, with a voice smooth as calm water, she said, Justice Thomas, I have a question. That single sentence was enough to break the stillness. Heads turned. The tone of her voice was respectful, but it carried a quiet fire beneath the surface. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her tone. She spoke like someone about to reshape the room. "You speak about morals," she said, "and I agree, they matter. But I've always believed that morals aren't proven by speeches. They're proven by choices." A few eyes widened. She wasn't defending. She was redefining. Thomas didn't interrupt. Maybe he wanted to hear where she would go next. Maybe he didn't realize yet that this would become the moment everyone remembered. Crockett's words rolled out with calm confidence. "You say morality means courage," she said. "But courage isn't pointing fingers. Courage is standing firm even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges your own reflection." The tone of the room shifted again. The tension that had been pressing down suddenly began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of realization. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet her words hit with more force than volume ever could. And for the first time since the hearing began, Clarence Thomas didn't immediately reply. He sat still, his hands folded, eyes steady, but the silence between them now belonged to her. The clash everyone had been waiting for hadn't exploded with noise. It was unfolding quietly through control and precision, and deep down everyone knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something that would change the entire tone of the room. The question wasn't whether Jasmine Crockett would respond. It was how far her response would go, and how fast it would turn the tables. What no one yet realized was that it would take her less than a minute, only 41 seconds, to do exactly that. The silence after Clarence Thomas's final words seemed to stretch endlessly. No one wanted to be the first to breathe too loudly or move too quickly. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. She sat perfectly still, the calm center of a storm that hadn't broken yet. When she finally spoke, her tone was low and even, not defensive, not angry, but deliberate. "Justice Thomas," she began, her voice steady, "I respect your history, your years on the bench, and the strength it takes to stand for what you believe. But I have to ask, whose morals are we talking about today?" A few people blinked, surprised by the quiet sharpness of her question. She wasn't matching his thunder with thunder. She was using precision instead. Her words slid through the heavy air with a quiet strength that demanded attention. She went on, "Because morality isn't one size fits all. It doesn't belong to one group, one generation, or one way of thinking. It grows as people learn. It changes as justice does. You said courage defines morality, and I agree. But courage isn't about looking down on others. It's about looking inward and asking hard questions about ourselves." Her tone was respectful, but her words carried the sting of truth. The same truth that can't be softened or dodged. The people in the room leaned in. There was something magnetic about the way she spoke, the way she turned the very foundation of Thomas's argument into a mirror reflecting right back at him. "Real morality," she continued, "isn't proven by what we say when everyone's watching. It's proven by what we do when no one is clapping." A small rustle went through the crowd. Some nodded quietly, as if her words had pulled at something inside them, a memory, a conviction, a doubt they'd buried. She didn't stop there. She looked directly at Thomas, her tone still calm but her message clear. "You've spent your life defending what you believe is right. I won't question your intentions, but let's be honest. Sometimes the people who speak the loudest about morals forget that morality starts with empathy. It's not a weapon we use to measure others. It's a promise we make to ourselves to stay fair no matter who stands across from us." Her words landed with a quiet thud of realization. The entire energy in the room began to shift. Where once Thomas had commanded the stage, now the light seemed to move toward her. "Morality," she said softly, "isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about admitting when the systems we built no longer serve the people they were meant to protect. And when that happens, it takes courage, real courage, to change." For a moment, Thomas's expression tightened, but he said nothing. He was listening now. Crockett continued, her voice steady and strong. "You speak of the past like it's the gold standard of integrity. But let's remember, the past is where many people weren't even allowed to speak for themselves. If those times defined morality, then we need a new definition." A hush fell over the room again. This time it wasn't out of tension but awe. She had taken his moral lecture and turned it into something human. something relatable, not about politics or power, but about people. Then came the moment that sealed it. She said morality should never be about control. It should be about compassion. Because power without compassion isn't strength. It's fear dressed as authority. Those words hit like lightning. They didn't explode, they illuminated. Everyone in that room could feel the temperature shift. Even those who supported Thomas couldn't deny what they were witnessing. Jasmine Crockett had just reshaped the entire discussion in less than a minute. Her delivery wasn't rushed. It was measured, almost musical. She spoke like someone who understood timing, how silence between words could be just as powerful as the words themselves. When she finished, she said simply, "So yes, Justice Thomas, morals do matter. But they matter most when they make us humble, not when they make us untouchable." Then she leaned back, hands folded, her expression calm once again. She didn't add another sentence. She didn't need to. The message was complete. The clock above the hearing room ticked softly. 41 seconds had passed. 41 seconds that changed the entire dynamic of the room. The crowd stayed frozen in silence. Thomas sat still, processing every word. The aides looked at one another, unsure if they'd just witnessed a respectful rebuttal or a quiet dismantling. Jasmine had done what few could. She hadn't raised her voice, but she'd raised the standard. She hadn't fought fire with fire. She'd smothered it with clarity. And as the silence deepened, everyone understood something important. The confrontation was no longer about who had the most authority. It was about who had the most truth. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her morals, she had revealed the cracks in the wall that had tried to stand over her. In less than a minute, the unshakable Clarence Thomas had met a force that didn't yell, didn't posture, and didn't retreat. It was control versus conviction, and conviction had just won. What began as an attack had turned into a revelation. The student hadn't just answered the teacher. She had rewritten the lesson, and for the first time that day, the most powerful voice in the room was quiet. For a few long seconds after Jasmine Crockett's words faded, the room was utterly still. The sound of silence carried its own kind of volume. You could feel it ripple through the air, pressing against everyone's chest. Heavy, charged, almost unbelievable. Clarence Thomas didn't move. His expression stayed composed, but there was a flicker, a tiny break in his stillness. The kind of pause that revealed he hadn't expected that level of precision, that kind of calm power. The people around the chamber exchanged glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was something deeper, a test of ideals, of composure, of truth under pressure. And Jasmine had turned it on its head with a grace that no one saw coming. A young aide sitting in the back whispered. She flipped it. It was barely audible, but in that kind of silence, even whispers carried. Jasmine didn't look proud or smug. She looked serene, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed. It wasn't the calm of someone who had won. It was the calm of someone who knew she didn't need to prove herself anymore. The tension that had been suffocating the room began to change shape. It didn't vanish, it transformed. What had started as quiet discomfort was now quiet admiration. Some people began to nod, slow and thoughtful. Others just sat back, trying to process what they'd seen. Clarence Thomas finally spoke, but this time his tone was different. It wasn't condescending or commanding. It was thoughtful. That was well said, he murmured. He looked down for a moment as though weighing her words, then added, "You believe in what you say." Jasmine met his eyes and replied simply, "I do, and I believe we all should." That line, simple as it was, landed like a closing statement. Not loud, not sharp, but final. What followed wasn't applause, it wasn't that kind of setting. But there was a collective shift. A shared recognition that something meaningful had just happened. Across the room, a woman sitting near the corner leaned forward and whispered, "Did she just shut him down?" Her colleague gave a small, knowing smile and whispered back, "Completely." The story of the confrontation would spread in quiet conversations later, not as gossip, but as a moment worth remembering. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something everyone needed to see. That calm intelligence could overpower authority when it spoke from truth. Clarence Thomas, usually the unshakable pillar of the room, looked as though he was thinking, really thinking. It wasn't often that anyone challenged him in a way that made him pause. But Jasmine's words hadn't been meant to humiliate him. They'd been meant to remind him and everyone else what real moral courage looked like. He leaned back slightly, his face composed, but the change was there. The edge in his demeanor had softened, replaced with a quiet kind of respect. Whether he admitted it aloud or not, something about her response had landed. Around them, the discussion slowly resumed, but the rhythm had shifted. The tone was gentler, the interruptions fewer. Even the people who usually filled the air with opinions seemed to choose their words more carefully now, as if Jasmine's calm precision had left an imprint on the entire room. A few minutes later, when the next speaker began to talk, no one was really listening. The focus lingered on what had just happened. That sharp, brief exchange that had turned the air electric and left behind something much larger than a debate. In the hallway afterward, people spoke quietly in clusters. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled, repeating fragments of her words like lines from a performance they wouldn't forget. "Power without compassion isn't strength," one person said under their breath, almost like quoting a proverb. And though Jasmine herself walked away without looking back, her presence stayed long after she left the room. For Clarence Thomas, the silence that followed wasn't defeat, it was reflection. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't triumph, and it was purpose. She had proven something without ever meaning to, that truth, spoken calmly and clearly, can stop even the loudest storm in its tracks. By the time she reached the corridor outside, a few people caught up to her, quietly saying things like, "That was brave," or "You made your point beautifully." She smiled politely, thanking them, but her expression showed something deeper. Focus, not pride. Inside the chamber, Thomas remained seated for a while, hands clasped, eyes distant. He wasn't angry. He was thoughtful, maybe even humbled. There are moments in a person's life when a single conversation shifts the ground beneath their feet. Not because they lose, but because they see something they hadn't before. This was one of those moments. And for those who witnessed it, the takeaway was unforgettable. They had come expecting another clash of ideologies, a predictable battle of power and principle. What they got instead was a masterclass in composure and moral clarity. One woman summed it up best as she walked out, still shaking her head. "He came at her with judgment," she said softly. She answered with truth. And that's why he couldn't win. That was the story that would echo beyond that room, passed on not through headlines or debates, but through quiet retellings of a powerful truth. In a world where people often shout to be heard, Jasmine Crockett had whispered, and the world had listened. That day, she didn't just shut down Clarence Thomas's attack. She shut down the very idea that authority alone defines what's right. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that strength isn't about volume or power. It's about knowing when silence says more than any speech ever could. Long after the session ended, the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered like a soft hum in the air, the kind that refuses to fade even when the noise dies down. People were still replaying it in their minds, trying to capture exactly what made those 41 seconds so unforgettable. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, calm, fearless, unshaken. For many, it became a quiet reminder that power doesn't always wear a robe or sit behind a bench. Sometimes it sits in the unbothered poise of someone who refuses to bow to intimidation. Clarence Thomas walked away that day with his usual measured stride, but even he knew something had shifted. Not just in the debate, but in the atmosphere, in the perception of what it meant to hold moral authority. Jasmine hadn't embarrassed him. She'd revealed something larger. That conviction and compassion could exist together, and when they did, they carried more strength than any title ever could. The story of that exchange spread quietly, like a whispered lesson between those who needed it most. Some took it as a sign that the new generation of leaders wasn't afraid to challenge the old guard, but not with anger or noise. With reason, with calm, with truth. In the days that followed, people spoke of Jasmine Crockett not as someone who defeated a justice, but as someone who reminded everyone what true integrity sounds like when it finally speaks. Her words weren't meant to wound. They were meant to wake something up. Power without compassion isn't strength. That line in particular was repeated like a mantra across offices, classrooms, and community meetings. It resonated because it wasn't political. It was human. Everyone at some point had seen power misused, words twisted, truths bent to convenience. And here was someone who, in less than a minute, cut through all of it, not with anger, but with wisdom. For Jasmine, the moment wasn't about victory. It was about standing firm in her beliefs, that justice means nothing without empathy, and that moral clarity isn't about pointing fingers, but holding mirrors. She had stood her ground not to prove she was right, but to remind others what rightness truly looks like. Clarence Thomas, for all his experience and stature, wasn't her enemy. He was the embodiment of the very question she had spent her career answering. What does it mean to lead with integrity? His challenge had given her the stage to show that moral authority doesn't belong to the loudest or the oldest voice in the room. It belongs to the clearest one. Over time, that exchange took on a life of its own. Professors discussed it when teaching about rhetoric and restraint. Mentors quoted it when guiding young advocates. Even ordinary people spoke of it as an example of how to stay composed when life tries to shake your foundation. One observer described it perfectly. It wasn't just a clash of ideas, it was a moment of truth between two generations. One defending the past, the other defining the future. And that's what made it timeless, the idea that leadership isn't measured by how much control you hold, but by how much clarity you offer. That confidence isn't about overpowering someone else. It's about never losing your footing, no matter who stands across from you. As the weeks went by, Jasmine's words began to resurface in unexpected places. In speeches about ethics, in classrooms discussing courage, in conversations about what it means to truly stand for something. They became a quiet anthem for those who'd ever been underestimated or silenced, because in her composure, people saw something they could relate to. That feeling of being spoken over, challenged unfairly or judged too quickly, and the realization that you don't need to shout to reclaim your voice. You just need to be sure of what you stand for. Jasmine Crockett had shown that day that dignity can be louder than anger. That truth, when spoken with confidence, doesn't need applause. It creates silence, the kind filled with realization. Clarence Thomas, for his part, never spoke publicly about that particular exchange. But those who were there knew it left a mark. Sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't learned in victory, but in the moment someone makes you stop and think. In the grander story, their confrontation wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about the power of restraint, the weight of words, and the meaning of moral clarity. It was a reminder that debates aren't won by force, they're won by balance. That real wisdom isn't about destroying an opponent, but elevating the discussion. And perhaps that's why the memory of that day refused to fade. It wasn't a story of attack and defense. It was a story of awakening, one that reminded everyone watching that strength and grace could share the same space. As Jasmine later reflected privately, sometimes the best way to shut down an attack is to stay rooted in truth. The louder someone questions your integrity, the quieter you should stand, because the truth doesn't need to shout. That was the real victory, not over Clarence Thomas, but over the idea that power alone defines morality. And so, her response became more than just a clever rebuttal. It became a message that stretched beyond that room into every space where people feel small before authority. It said, "You don't need to fight to be heard. You just need to speak with conviction." That day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut down a moral attack. She gave a masterclass in how clarity, courage, and compassion can turn even the harshest confrontation into a lesson for the ages. And long after the words had faded, the lesson remained. A quiet, enduring truth whispered by those who remembered strength doesn't shout. Strength stands.